Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're just waiting for people to join the webinar. We're listing in the chat box what city or community you live in, and we'll get started in just a few seconds. All right. Thank you all for joining the webinar. My name is Jennifer Lamb. I am running the Zoom, and I'll just start with a few housekeeping items. Feel free to continue typing in the chat box what city community you live in. Susan, if you can forward the slide. So continue writing in the chat box where you're from, and next slide. Just a few housekeeping items. We are recording today's webinar. And so just wanted to let everyone know if there's any issues or concerns, please let us know. Next slide. And everyone is muted on entering in the webinar just to reduce background noise, but we do encourage you to keep your video on when you're chatting with others, especially in the discussion breakout groups later on. And we recommend also using this chat box to ask any questions, make any comments, and just due to the lack of time in this webinar, we won't have any Q&A for the speakers. So please do put your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer the chat questions. And if we need more time to look into the questions, we will follow up with answers in a follow-up email after the webinar. And so everyone's muted. If you're on the phone, which I'm not sure we have any people on the phone, but you just need to press *6 to mute or unmute yourself. And if there's any technical difficulties, you can chat me directly in the chat box or email me as well. Next slide. And just the layout on the Zoom window to mute or unmute yourself, it's in the lower left-hand side of your screen. And then the chat box, there's a little chat button right in the middle, bottom middle, to find the chat box there. Next slide. And I'll hand it off to the HEAT Task Force co-chairs.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ever Rodriguez. I am the co-chair of the Extreme Heat Task Force that has put together this webinar. I want to welcome you and thank you very much for making time to join us today for the webinar, Extreme Heat and Current Hazards, Lessons Learned from an Unprecedented Summer, and I should say also an unprecedented year. So this afternoon, we have a great panel of speakers who not only bring to us essential information about programs and services provided throughout the county of San Mateo, but who are also passionate about the role they play in providing those services and advancing the programs they will talk about. Next slide, please. As you can see, we have a packed agenda filled with really interesting and essential topics. After my welcome, we will hear from Kim Springer from the Office of Sustainability and also a co-chair on the HEAT Task Force. He will talk about the Extreme Heat Task Force effort and the Climate Ready San Mateo County Collaborative. We will then proceed to hear the speakers whose bios you should have received on an earlier email. First, we will hear from Mr. Marcus Griswold from the Office of Sustainability, who will be presenting on the San Mateo County climate change related extreme heat modeling. Following is Mr. Kevin Rose from the San Mateo County Office of Emergency Services, presenting on countywide emergency protocols. After him, we will hear from Dr. Curtis Chan from San Mateo County Health, presenting on health protocol and the impact on health. Then we will hear from Ms. Erin Niemeyer from the City of Redwood City Parks, Recreation, and Community Services, who will talk about city protocols and heat response. And finally, I will also be presenting as well on North Fair Oaks heat resiliency efforts. After the presentations, we will go into separate breakout rooms to have a discussion on how multiple hazards and COVID-19 acted as disruptors for heat and other emergency preparedness and response actions. And after the breakout rooms exercise, we will hear reports from some of those breakout groups, and we will look at what the next steps may be. Now I will pass it on to the co-chair, Kim Springer, from the Office of Sustainability. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Ever, and good morning, or good afternoon, I should say, to everyone. I'm Kim Springer, co-chair of the Extreme Heat Task Force and Energy and Water Programs Manager in the Office of Sustainability. I'll provide a little bit of background on the task force and the impetus for this webinar. Extreme Heat Task Force is part of Climate Ready San Mateo County Collaborative, which is a cross-sector and community effort to prepare for climate impacts such as wildfire, flooding, and heat. We'll hear from Marcus Griswold shortly about some of the Climate Ready heat modeling. And you may also visit the link that you see, Climate Ready San Mateo County or climatereadysmc.org, to subscribe to the Climate Ready newsletter and to learn more about the entire program. Next slide, please. So the Climate Ready San Mateo County Extreme Heat Task Force is a collaboration of Office of Sustainability, San Mateo County Health, and really a diverse group of community and government leaders. Right now, I want to acknowledge the leadership of co-chair Belen Sierra of County Health Policy and Planning, her involvement in developing this webinar, and she's now currently on maternity leave. And I'd also like to celebrate that Ever Rodriguez recently joined to step in as the co-chair, and we thank you for your support, Ever, as we continue our planning efforts. To all of you participating today, your input during this webinar will be a great help to identify key gaps and opportunities and to inform our direction as we continue fleshing out our short and long-term task force work plan. If the work of this task force is of particular interest to you, you may join. And so I think that we'll put into chat Hannah Doress's email address, and she would be the person to contact for joining in. Next slide, please. In response to concerns raised by the Extreme Heat Task Force members, Belen and Hannah led some ad hoc meetings this summer. And many of the things that we heard that, there are many low-income residents, they lack air conditioning, air filters for, of course, the pollution, even shade. And there was some special concern for elders afraid to leave their homes as a result of COVID. Residents were very hot, but the usual cooling centers, pools, and libraries that they were relying on in the past were not open due to COVID. And community leaders and task force members also recommended the county distribute more heat safety education, especially when high heat is expected or there's during a heat emergency. In terms of products or things that people could do, more information really about rental and home weatherization retrofits, shade structures, water misters, and portable air conditioning as well. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, community leaders were uncertain about how to get heat emergency information and also what protocols were in place. So part of the purpose of today's webinar is to learn about emergency protocols, current practices and efforts, and climate modeling, to connect leaders and community members concerned about heat, and to learn from the recent experience of heat in combination with multiple hazards. I think we all experienced lightning and fires, the resulting poor air quality, higher heat after that, and then rotating power outages to boot. So it's been quite a year. A quick thank you to those who responded to the webinar pre-survey. For those surveys, we heard similar themes. Cities and communities had different challenges staying cool this year, such as not being able to open doors and windows due to poor air quality, and cooling shelters were not available due to COVID. We also heard great ideas from specific cities and communities around being better prepared and more resilient, establishing cooling centers that are evenly distributed across the county, solar power and battery backup for community facilities, and broadening community outreach as well. We look forward to diving into more discussion around these and other topics in our breakout groups later. Overall, we seek to identify cross-sector and community strategies to prepare for next summer and key gaps and opportunities that community members who are most, that affect community members that are most vulnerable to heat. As was mentioned before, just a quick note that due to the agenda, which is pretty packed, we won't have Q&A after speakers, but again, we really encourage you to put those questions into chat and we'll collect them all up at the end of the event, answer them as we can as we go along. And during the breakout rooms also, if you have questions, write down your questions and then put them into the chat once we all gather back together again. And with that, I think that we'll go ahead and move on to our speakers. The next slide, please. So it's my pleasure to introduce Marcus Griswold, Senior Sustainability Specialist with the Climate Change Team in the Office of Sustainability. So take it away, Marcus.
Wonderful, thanks Kim, and thanks for that context. And as you kind of heard a little bit and you've experienced this year and over the past 2 years, we've had these extremely hot days that are unexpected. We've had wildfire that has placed a lot of us at risk in the community, both directly and with air quality issues, smoke coming into our communities, coming into our homes, making it hard for people with existing conditions and health issues. And the other impacts that we are expecting to see, and we've spent a lot of time looking at, are thinking about what happens as the Earth heats up and our oceans expand and we see sea level rise occurring along the bayside and the coast side. And then what happens when we have more of these storms that we've seen with El Niños and other really intense precipitation events coming along in the county. So that's what we've been spending time thinking about, and we've been working with consultants and scientists to understand what those impacts are. And just to kind of ground you all in the work that the county is doing, we are working to both reduce our greenhouse gases as well as to reduce the impacts of climate change, and they need to happen at the same time. So the Board of Supervisors approved a climate emergency declaration to both work to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, but also to look for ways that we can be more resilient to the changes that we're seeing today and we're expecting to see in the future. And how do we do that for the people that are most vulnerable? Next. So we've taken this three-tiered approach around collaboration, as many of you have participated in our convenings and our sea level rise vulnerability assessment know that our approach is to really bring you all together to understand the science and understand how that science looks at the risk to the county, whether that's flooding or heat, and then to start thinking about how do we engage people around those issues and move into taking action. So we spent the past couple of years looking at what the risk is, and now over the next 2 years, we're going to really start to think about how do we plan this, how do we prepare for it, how do we initiate pilot projects. And that's why you all are here. So we're really hoping that this first webinar will really kick us off into that strategy process. Next. So I'm going to go over a few of the outcomes from the model. And this is work that we'll be sharing a little bit more comprehensively as we do outreach. But really what we're seeing is as we move into the future, as we see our greenhouse gases rise, as we see the climate change, in the next 10 years, we could see temperatures increasing by 1.4 to 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit. And then by 2070, we could see temperatures rising as much as 3.8 to 5 degrees. So the events that we're seeing this year and the year before could become more commonplace. So how do we prepare for those? How do we prepare for those now? Next. And we really wanted to kind of dig into better understand what are the vulnerabilities in the communities that all of you live in and all of you work in the county. So we looked across different tools that the state's been using, the Association Bay Area of Governments has been using, the transportation agencies, and how do we look at these in terms of the county? So looking at issues such as, do you own a vehicle? What are housing burdens in the region? What are your ages? And, are there older people that might have medically sensitive issues to air quality and flooding? So thinking about, what are the conditions that would place people more vulnerable, but how do we then transition that into action? Next. So this study was done, we had brought in KQED, study was done to look at the county vulnerability to increasing extreme events. And you can see, if you look at the top, you'll see San Mateo County is kind of one of the ones that's ranked a little bit lower. And I think one thing to bring out from that is that it's a little bit of a misnomer because our county is not necessarily used to heat. We're not used to extreme heat, whereas some of the other counties, such as Sacramento, are already experiencing this heat and have experienced it for a while. So part of it is how do we address, the adaptive capacity? How do we make sure that people are prepared for that? And how do we look at thinking about strategies to address those issues? And I'll get to, some of those issues that are facing us on the ground in the next slides. Next. So part of what we have worked on is putting the model into the interactive viewer that we're hoping to launch in the near future. And you can see this model shows us where do we expect there to be high heat days in 2070. And you can see there are regions throughout East Palo Alto, North Fair Oaks, and San Carlos that are showing up as dark. And that means these higher heat days. Next. And then we looked at the social vulnerability layers that we talked about earlier. And we said, where are there places that heat is going to arise in 2070 or earlier? And then where does that overlay with the people that are most vulnerable to changes in heat? So that's what this map is showing you. And you can see that where those darker red areas and the darker purple areas are, there's going to be a lot more vulnerability. And that lets us help think about, what are the strategies to work on? Who are the communities that we need to engage, and how do we engage them? Next. So this is one of our outputs from the map countywide, and this is high heat days. So we have the existing heat, which is 1995, and that's using the state database. And then we move to 2030 and 2070. And as you can see, as you get to 2070, the key areas that we're concerned about are in East Palo Alto area, the North Fair Oaks area, up to the bridge, the 92 bridge, and then over down in Pescadero in the community in the South Coast. And a lot of that reason for the coastal issues is because of kind of changes in fog patterns in the region. So on the coastal side, I think a lot of our concerns come around farm workers and people that might be living without air conditioning. And then on the urban North Fair Oaks and East Palo Alto side, we'll hear a lot more about that later today. Next. Then the other issue we're also concerned about that has come up is something called cooling degree days. And the easiest way to understand this is it's basically what is the increase in the need for air conditioning in the county. And this is important because this is one of the biggest vulnerabilities that we might have. While we might not have as many high heat days as other counties, we also have the fewest number of air conditioners of any other county in the region. So in a lot of ways, we're not necessarily prepared for that. So we could see over 600% increase in the number of degree days, which will put us at this great need for air conditioning. And people that are not accessing air conditioning for a number of reasons might then be at risk of other medical issues, as well as air quality issues from asthma and vulnerabilities such as that. So these are kind of the issues we're going to keep going through as we move forward in the webinar, and we can go to the next slide. So I'm going to let the rest of the group take over, and I'm going to pass this over to Kevin Rose, who is with our Office of Emergency Services.
Great, thank you, Marcus. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I'd also like to thank the Extreme Heat Task Force and the Office of Sustainability for putting on this afternoon's event. I'm Kevin Rose with the San Mateo County Office of Emergency Services. I'm actually coming to you from the County Emergency Operations Center, where we've been activated since March for the COVID response, and we have also had to be activated and respond to, in concert, the CZU August Lightning Fire Complex response, and now we're in the recovery, as well as the August rolling blackouts, the August heat wave, the October public safety power shutoffs, as well as the June protests that we had in early summer. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is essentially a little background information on OES, as it pertains to the county and to the cities, as well as talking about some components of the county's extreme temperature plan as it pertains to heat. If we could go to the next slide. So OES, essentially how we operate are two roles. First one is we are the emergency services unit for our residents, unincorporated residents, kind of similar to how our board of supervisors operates as the city council and the governing board. The other role we play is a bigger role where we're considered the operational area. And this kind of goes to the heart and core of what is sort of like the emergency management Bible or rule book, which is the Standardized Emergency Management System, or SEMS. And essentially what that entails is that all 20 cities have their own Office of Emergency Services or emergency managers. And just as we've learned that all disasters are local, and typically we have first responder resources that are able to handle the day-to-day events. If those expand to a greater issue, say for example, the San Juan Canyon fire or the Sign Hill fires that we witnessed, that becomes the local event that the cities are responding to and receiving support within the county. The county then is the next level to provide resources, support, equipment, etc. And then of course to the region, to the state, and then to the feds. And the feds are really the ones where what we do a lot of planning with in concert with the cities are the really big situations, the pandemic, the earthquake, the tsunami, the big fires, the big floods, the big landslides, and next slide, extreme temperature. So extreme temperature is a public health issue. Of course, we have the health department at the county level. And so we basically endeavor to make sure that we have a plan in place. Some of the cities themselves may have their own extreme temperature plans also that are to complement the city's plan. But this one is, as I mentioned, public health, but also the roles that are played within this include the Office of Emergency Services, that happens a lot with the coordination, and then our Human Services Agency that deals with the care and shelter aspect. Next slide, please. And I do want to note that essentially the county plan deals with both cold, which is more aligned with our Human Services Agency and the homeless shelter programs. As you can see, these last couple of nights have gotten down into the 30s and 40s. And so we do have extended warning shelter programs that we initiate where the county plays the role to ensure that these services are provided through our core service agencies, but we also have the heat side of this plan as well, where cities do play a role providing for their residents, like cooling centers. For the extreme heat plan, we have the 3 phases that are listed there. The first one is seasonal readiness. That also includes what we're doing today. This is more of that information aspect with regards to, taking a look at our plans, making sure we're aligned with our stakeholders, our partners in advance of the heat season or event. Even sometimes doing exercises to make sure our plans are working accordingly. Just basically making sure that the partners in the plan is somewhat in place. When the plan is actually entering the heat realm, that's when phase 2 comes along, and that's a heat alert. And heat alerts are basically where And I saw a question that was inquiring about who does those types of notifications. And just similarly as the Bay Area Air Quality Management District deals with air quality issues, it's actually the National Weather Service that our health department and Office of Emergency Services look to help us out in essence of forecasting weather within the Bay Area and even down to the peninsula of expected heat that might be coming in. And so phase 2 is when, a few days in advance that we're noticing that there might be heat patterns that may require some activation. Normally the first few hot days that we incur, what we do is a lot of cities do this as well, public messaging through social media, just reminding people of caution to take with everything that they have to deal with for their families, their pets, within the community, checking on neighbors, which is important, of course. And so there's that communication of getting ready. And then the cities themselves and the county are kind of in a waiting pattern to see more so, as National Weather Service will explain, 72 hours out is the most scientific for when weather predictions occur. And then phase 3 is the heat emergency. Now for the county, that is actually, as listed there, we have triggers that equal a phase 3. And I do want to share, as I mentioned, cities themselves have plans that might have other triggers. As you know, North County is cooler, but 80 degrees can be more intense to the North County as, say, perhaps 90 degrees to South County. It's all about acclimation and what you're used to living in. So this is the countywide plan for activation. It's the daytime heat index being greater than 104 degrees. And Dr. Curtis Chan, who follows me, will go more into the science and health aspect and the heat index as well. And then nighttime temperatures being greater than 75 degrees. And these are occurrences that are from 1 to 3 days, but typically more than 3 days is when we have that activation. Next slide, please. So essentially with that activation, once we've reached that level, as mentioned, this is information coming to us from the National Weather Service. So as we've heard from the health officer, where he has what's referred to as a daily situational awareness tool, that basically entails, oops, did we forward one accidentally? If we could go back one slide. Thank you. So yeah, the daily situational awareness tool, the health officer has health indicators that helps him track what's going on with the community, and heat is one of them during the summertime. So he pays close attention to it. Office of Emergency Services pays close attention to it. If we hit that level, we do have a conference call with the cities. We bring in meteorologists from the National Weather Service. We have great partners with the National Weather Services. Bring health on board, Human Services Agency, and let them know that the heat is indicating a level and prediction that they may want to consider activating cooling centers. Now, mind you, all cities within their own right for their residents are responsible for and can make and do make those independent decisions about activation of cooling centers, which actually did occur this August, I believe within City of Redwood City. And I know City of Millbury also activated for a few days for their residents. So cities on their own can do an activation without necessarily waiting for the county. It's the county that gives them some of that data and knowledge, basically indicate why or why not for the activation. And one of the things to note that, yes, while we do have the common cooling centers of being the malls or community centers or libraries, where indeed that they do or were throughout COVID-19 inactivated, the cities themselves are able to open up and essentially allow the cooling centers to operate with their staff, etc. And then, of course, as the event continues, as I mentioned beforehand, as I'm getting the gong, if this were to increase to a higher level, just as we're doing right now with our Emergency Operations Center, we would activate accordingly. So final slide with my information. And then I'm really happy actually to introduce Dr. Curtis Chan for the reason that when I was with the health department in the early 2000s, he and I started about the same time for the H1N1 pandemic and the first health plan. And he had gone to, I think, the city and county of San Francisco, but we're happy when he was an assistant health officer. He's a returning champion, as now the deputy health officer, that we're very fortunate to have him. So Dr. Chan.
Hey, Kevin. Nice to see you again. It was great to work with you as well. I think 14 years ago when we wrote the initial heat plan, there was no such thing as Zoom. So it's good to be on a Zoom call with you all here. So the next slide. So I think as the previous speaker, as Marcus was highlighting, San Mateo doesn't have a lot of huge heat events, but that really makes it more important that we focus on the social inequities, those communities and individuals who are most vulnerable. And really in doing so, we could actually create a more healthy and just San Mateo County just by the fact we're addressing a common threat together. We're thinking about how different agencies, whether they're county agencies, city departments, and how do we collaborate with community-based organizations, particular community groups, and those groups and those community partners often really know what's best for our community. So this is really a great exercise for us to work together. And so, I think in my 7 or 8 minutes, I think just want to highlight those different things. I think Kim and Hannah wanted me to highlight particularly for the health agency. So just like all of your agencies, we have a prevention approach in which we think upstream preventions. What's the primary upstream reason why there are inequities of different people being affected by any threat, whether it's a wildfire smoke, COVID-19, hypertension, cardiac disease, tuberculosis, and even heat events. I mean, it's a little bit unique for San Mateo County because in the south part of the county, it is much hotter. But there's many aspects of prevention. And then I think to answer specifically the question, we think of our agency as many different parts with many employees, and some of our programs, just like yours, provide direct services. For example, those who are older adults, those who are being taken care of in our skilled nursing facilities, we have healthcare. But I think what we're here today is to really focus on collaboration. Heat is a great example, like I said, of if we collaborate together and we really try to understand what are the root causes of why different communities are adversely affected by heat, why North Fair Oaks and Atherton might be next to each other, but the people in North Fair Oaks, they might have similar temperatures outside, but if the tree coverage of those streets, if there's less these micro winds coming back and forth, if there's if the windows are less protected from with shade, those are the things that are going to cause larger inequities in health impact. So the next slide. So I think when all of you as community-based organizations and cities who are preparing for a heat response, I mean, I think like the CDC's documents on its websites are really good. They have a particular playbook there. And these are 2 documents of this. And the epidemiology that the state and local governments have really focus on, for example, those who've been hospitalized with heat strokes. But that really represents like a small tip of the iceberg of how a particular community can be really affected. You could just imagine the heat impact of a abuela taking care of grandchildren in North Fair Oaks without any good shade for the day. Those families may not be going to the emergency room or might not be hospitalized for a heat stroke, but they're going to be adversely affected. So these are the different levels of heat symptoms you could have and some evidence-based treatment options. And another example of how this is even extends beyond these illness categories. When I was in San Francisco during last year's heat event, over one weekend in mid-June, San Francisco General Hospital had 4 hospitalizations of children less than 4 years old who fell out of windows. 2 of them came from the Mission District area of San Francisco, and 2 of them came from North County, San Mateo. Right? 4 young children who fell out of windows, I forgot if I said that, all 4 of them fell out of windows because of, I think, what Marcus was saying. We're not used to hot weather here. So when it was really hot, everybody opened the windows and the young kids were just leaning on the screens and they all fell out, or there weren't any screens. So that's just an example of some of the policies that we could have to protect children and older adults from heat emergencies. Next slide. So as Kevin was saying, the heat index and how we determine the impact on humans is this combination. On the top row there, as you go to the left, is humidity. So as the weather becomes more humid, there's more of a human impact and more of a health impact, the more humid or suffocating it feels. And of course, as you know, the hotter it is, the more it contributes to the heat index too. So that's how the National Weather Service combines humidity and temperature. As both rise, there's going to be a larger effect on health. Next slide. And I think, as Kevin was saying, this is what our health department and county OES and other emergency response partners uses. It's similar to what we used in San Francisco and what California uses. I think those are the general concepts. I think in preparing for this event, I think for this upcoming year, there might be some room for us to reconsider and think about what the actual triggers are and what the response would be for each county agency or city to respond. I think, and also each community-based organization and city should be able to make their own decisions too about how conservative you want to go. And often you and your cities are really going to know best. It's not just only based upon the weather in terms of heat index, but it's also just the conditions of the housing and the risk factor that your communities have. The next slide. So yeah, so I was really excited to see all the slides already, and I saw the discussion items. And again, as Marcus was highlighting, there are a few hospitalizations and a few deaths every year that are possibly related to heat in San Mateo. But I think that's just one aspect of it. I think if we work together, we'll be able to solve things like, for example, wildfires and wildfire smoke, public safety shutoffs. So all those things are really relevant to our developing a good heat response plan. So thank you, and I look forward to more discussion this afternoon with you all.
Great.
And I'm happy
go ahead.
to introduce Aaron Niemeyer from Redwood City, and again, really appreciate the partnership between county agencies and city departments.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Since March, our department has been primarily focused on providing essential services for our community. All normal programming has been shut down. So with the record number of fires and with the record heat, we opened these cooling and air quality relief centers as part of those essential services. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the program, our safety and cleaning protocols, and also lessons learned for the future and for anybody else that is going to open cooling centers. There was definitely a learning curve for us and an added layer of that with COVID as well. So our activation protocol was 3 consecutive days of 85 degrees or more, or an air quality index of 125 or above. Our city also went into a kind of a standby mode if the AQI was over 100, but if there were higher temperatures, we did go ahead and activate those centers. It's a pretty flexible protocol, but we wanted to do what was best for our community. So we tried to be very proactive in terms of activation to see, with logistics and staffing to make sure we can open it when our community needed to be opened. We were actually activated 22 days over the course of the summer, and we opened at Red Morton Community Center, the Red Morton Main Library, or Redwood City Main Library, excuse me, and also the Redwood Shores Library. And if you're familiar with Redwood City, those are all different locations throughout the city. We were open to all, including pets. So we had dogs, we had cats and carriers. People were very appreciative the fact that they could bring their animals to us. The duration of stay was about 15 to 45 minutes. We had Wi-Fi available, so people would do work, kids would come in and do homework, and restrooms were a really big deal. Trying to find an open public restroom in the summer was nearly impossible. So for those who wandered in or those who knew about the fact that our center was activated, we're very appreciative of the fact that we had open restrooms. So our activations were communicated on social media, through email, direct outreach to our seniors, and also our homeless concentration down in downtown Redwood City. Regrettably, the centers were not heavily used. We sometimes average 0 to 20 a day, but for those who did attend, they were very appreciative of a cool space in which to spend some time with us. Next slide, please. I think the other way. One more. So our safety and cleaning protocols, with that added layer of COVID, the #1 priority for us was our staff and community member safety. A lot of our staff had not worked for a couple months, and there was that hesitancy to come back, especially inside a building. So we really wanted to make sure that our staff felt comfortable and that our community felt comfortable attending our centers. So upon entry, we asked the standard COVID questions. Masks were required, and for those community members that did not have them, they were provided for them. We did do temperature checks. We took information for contact tracing, and we also had standing hand sanitizer stations upon entry and throughout the building. We had socially distant tables. Fortunately, the rooms that we used were very large, so we were able to spread the tables out a fair distance. And we disinfected the tables and chairs and restrooms after each use. That was very important to us and obviously very important to the community that was using our facility. We also, because we don't have normal programming, we had the ability to have breakout rooms. So if we had an abundance of seniors or people with pets or families that had young children, we were able to kind of separate them. One, for the exposure risk, and two, it's really hard to concentrate when kids are running around the gym. So it worked out really well. We also had water available for the participants, and we started using air quality monitors. We wanted to ensure that the quality of air inside of our facility was at a healthy level. And even opening a door for a short period of time drastically affected the air quality in our facilities. So next slide, please. So lessons learned and future considerations. We really paid attention to the temperature forecast and the AQI forecast. As soon as a fire would hit, which seemed like it was constant, it was only a matter of time before it affected our community. So we really wanted to be proactive in when we opened up our facility. We definitely need to increase our outreach to vulnerable populations, more specifically seniors and the homeless population downtown. And if you're in facilities like I am, you really need to understand your HVAC system. A lot of our buildings are older. Generators may have been put in later. You really need to just understand how your facility works in order to operate these cooling centers. One of the things to pay attention to is a holiday schedule. In many facilities for the city, the temperature, the air conditioning doesn't necessarily, is not at full strength over a holiday schedule. So if you are activated, make sure you talk to your building maintenance department and get that on a normal schedule. Some of our rooms were motion activated. The plus side to that is energy savings and efficiency. But if it's not heavily attended, the room definitely won't be as cool as you would hope it to be when people go in there. And most importantly, if you have a backup generator, understand how that affects your air conditioning. We did have a situation where there was a power shutdown, and we learned a lot about our generator. So you really need to know whether it powers your AC or if it's just emergency lighting and just minimal power, because that will drastically affect the temperature in your facilities. And lastly, staffing levels with COVID, we really wanted to ensure that we had enough staff there to follow our safety and cleaning protocols. Because it wasn't heavily attended, it wasn't that big of an issue, but just to keep that in mind, that you just need enough staff in order to follow the protocols that are set in place. The next slide, please. Next slide. These are just examples of our cooling centers signage. They are in English and in Spanish. And next slide, please. This is just an example of our social media outreach. Very cute popsicle with a mask, in both in English and in Spanish as well. And next slide. So this is my contact information. I definitely learned a lot about opening these centers over the summer with that added layer of COVID. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And thank you very much. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak on behalf of Redwood City. And now I'm going to pass the presentation on to Ever Rodriguez, who is the chairman of the North Fair Oaks Community Council.
Thank you very much, Erin. And hello again, I'm Ever Rodriguez, chairman for the North Fair Oaks Community Council. Next slide, please. I'm going to start with a brief historical and socio-demographic perspective to give some background. North Fair Oaks is essentially an unincorporated area surrounded by the cities of Menlo Park, Redwood City, and Atherton, with an approximate 15,000 residents in less than a 2-mile area. The social makeup comprises a majority Latinx population, about 75%, a few Pacific Islanders, around 3 to 5%. Those on the Redwood City zip code side, and they're intermixed with a more affluent Caucasian cohort residing on the Menlo Park zip code area. And so let me explain you that zip code division. So essentially what it is that if you're looking at the screenshot right now, the slide, it shows the boundaries and the map of North Fair Oaks. So on the upper left side is the Redwood City side, and roughly around 6th Avenue towards Menlo Park. That is the Menlo Park zip code area, and that zip code division, it is interesting because I think even mentally affects people in the sense that there was a number of years ago, there was an effort to incorporate North Fair Oaks, and so the folks on the side of Menlo Park, a majority didn't feel like they wanted to incorporate to Redwood City because there is that sort of that nuance about belonging to an area that may somehow reflect or affect property values. So that that division exists right there, and so historically this has been an underserved community, particularly the Latino community, with no recreational green spaces or parks. And while there are lots of trees on the Menlo Park side of our neighborhood, as a contrast, there are very few to no trees on the Redwood City side. Next slide, please. In terms of impacts of heat in the North Fair Oaks community, a combination of socioeconomic disadvantages and poorly maintained housing infrastructure due to costs has led to existing homes in North Fair Oaks that are either badly or not insulated, or built with older materials that retain heat or that do not reflect heat away from structures. So when you compound these with the fact that no air conditioning is implemented in many of those older houses and no portable AC systems are available, you can see that heat waves are much worse for these residents who in normal times during a heat wave would go to a nearby library, shopping mall, a movie theater, or a beach to cool off during peak hours. And by the way, the slides, a couple of slides, including this one and the next, the screenshot right now, these are merely posts that we did on social media. They're not necessarily put in here for you to read because the text is way too small and too much. But it's just to illustrate, you know, some of the postings that we were doing in social media. Providing alternatives. Those were all in Spanish for people who were trapped in their home in North Fair Oaks. So during the pandemic, all those very public cooling alternatives were closed and unavailable, leaving North Fair Oaks residents to fend off the heat and the smoke from surrounding fires while trapped at home. In some cases, dreading or dealing with electricity shutoffs. Next slide, please. The only alternative that some community stakeholders saw was to provide information that could help residents to better deal with the climate conditions. With our local community organization, the North Fair Oaks Community Alliance, we resorted to providing information on social media, including Facebook and Nextdoor, postings as a preventative measure for support, providing advice on what to do during a heat wave to stay cool indoors, and how to make an affordable air filter at home with cheap materials. And we were also including daily air quality postings to give people an idea of how bad the air was outside. There was a comment on the chat just now about the insufficient messaging provided by county during the hot spells. And I agree, because they were relatively brief. So to counteract or to complement, I should say, such messaging, we in North Fair Oaks additionally consulted with a nurse practitioner for specific recommendations, thus providing additional and detailed alternatives in language appropriate alternatives. Next slide, please. And apparently this year's numbers of very hot days broke record that had been set last year in 2019. And if we continue to get an increasing number of hot days during a year, this will require critical work from county and cities to provide cooling centers and or additional medical services to deal with extreme weather events. But also, it would be essential to provide basic and language appropriate information to underserved and vulnerable communities as added measures to current emergency contingency plans from county and cities. Next slide, please.
And we need to wrap up also.
Yes, thank you. Finally, this image clearly shows where the trees are and are not in North Fair Oaks. The upper left side is the Redwood City side. The lower right is the Mellow Park, as I was mentioning before. Under the realization that climate change is here now and that it poses serious threats to vulnerable communities, community stakeholders in North Fair Oaks have been advocating for low-hanging fruit tree actions that we can do right away while we wait for mainstream actions to be enacted. As I mentioned before, North Fair Oaks lacks trees, and with trees being an all-around perfect solution to sequester CO2, to provide oxygen, shade, and health benefits to people. We team up with Canopy, a local nonprofit organization working on reforestation, who has received a grant from CAL FIRE to plant trees in East Palo Alto and North Fair Oaks for carbon sequestration, and also with the Stanford Future Bay Initiative, our research education practice partnership, also with Actera and the Siena Youth Center to plant trees in the North Fair Oaks area. The next slide, please. The Stanford Future Initiative team was able to gather data to create a dashboard to help Canopy pinpoint properties that would benefit from planting trees in front yards. Benefits include providing shade to front yards and houses, but also shading sidewalks on the streets to reduce the urban heat island effect. We also applied for a small grant from San Mateo County Measure K to incentivize tree ownership, giving tree candidates 100 gift card to spur gardening. Next slide, please. And that's an example of the dashboard that Future Bay Initiative created for us. And just to end it, next slide, please. Finally, just would like to say that it is super important to start promoting environmental friendliness at the local level with easy, doable actions rather than waiting until a state, nation, or a global plan comes about. We could potentially start changing people's behavior, as many residents are eager and ready to make a difference in the environment. And that's all I have. Thank you very much. Next is Hannah Doress from the Office of Sustainability, who will be guiding us through the breakout discussion groups. Next slide.
Great, thank you so much, Ever. Thanks everybody for being here today. So we're headed into a 20-minute breakout discussion. I'm gonna try to bring us through this pretty quickly so we can get to the fun stuff. So here are the questions we're going to discuss. Oh, and thank you for bringing the slides forward, Susan. So considering the summer we've just experienced with multiple high heat days combined with the pandemic, wildfires, which including fire and smoke, and some power shutoffs, the first question is, what were some of the strategies or interventions that your city or community group or other organization, neighborhood, etc., implemented to ease the impact of these hazards on community residents and in particular vulnerable community members? And the second question is, what are the lessons learned from the summer? And what would you do differently next summer if we're faced with similar multiple hazard scenarios again? Next slide, please. One of our extreme heat task force goals is to understand how vulnerability intersects with extreme heat risk. And vulnerability can mean many things. So to focus our conversation, let's think about three types of vulnerability. One is geographical vulnerability, for example, where you are in the county and what may be happening there that's distinctive. Social vulnerability, social characteristics that might make it harder to protect oneself. That could be outdoor workers, low-income residents, language barriers, etc. And physical vulnerability, such as age, health, or disability. Next slide, please. And we're looking forward to a really engaging and inclusive conversation today. We're really glad you're here. And to support productive conversation, we wanted to recommend cultural humility practices developed by the San Mateo County Health Office of Diversity and Equity. And these are: listen to understand, be disciplined about not making assumptions, observe and reflect on one's own reactions, practice I statements when speaking. It's okay to respectfully disagree, take risks, no pressure to speak, no blaming or shaming, confidentiality if personal stories are shared, and the courage to interrupt if something is going amiss or being left out of the conversation, making the invisible visible. And that takes courage, so thank you for raising things if you think they're being missed. Next slide. So just a reminder about your Zoom functions. Microphone on the left is mute, unmute. The cartoon speaking bubble is the chat, which you'll want to have open to be able to see activity there. We really want to learn from you, so please keep the focus on your thoughts and save any speaker Q&A or factual questions to put in the chat when we reconvene, so we can make sure to respond to those. Time will be limited, so please share briefly and add additional details in the chat. Your facilitator will take notes, and when we come back, we'll have time for a few share outs. So we really want to encourage each of you to comment in the chat, you know, top line insights that you had or questions or anything that you think is important. So Jen is going to split us into the groups now. Thanks so much.
Again.
I hope everybody had a great conversation.
Yeah, there wasn't enough time, so that means it was good.
Exactly. I know. I'm just, my mind is blown by the great ideas that that were in our group. Thank you, everybody. Are we still, Jen, are people still coming back?
I think I think everyone should be back in now.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you, everybody, for jumping in and sharing some great ideas. I know our group was a lot of fun. The first thing I want to encourage is for all the facilitators and all the participants to share in the chat anything that really stood out or some key points. Facilitators, the overall picture from your group, and participants, something that was important to you or a question or comment. So
should we put up the slides? Should we put up the slide? The last couple.
We could we don't need this one, but we could put up the next one as soon as we're done.
Okay, sounds great.
Yeah. So we have about 3 minutes here, and I wondered if anybody has a burning, any of the facilitators have something burning they want to share from their group. Feel free to raise your hand. And others can help me look out because I don't think I can see everybody at the same time.
So it looks like Susan's got her hand raised.
Okay, Susan.
I was just going to say, we talked a lot about thinking to the future about how helpful tree planting can be. And we heard about how Canopy is a nonprofit that can help communities in North Fair Oaks and East Palo Alto identifying which trees to plant where, and you know how to plant them for shading, and they actually do the planting and provide maintenance for 3 years. That sounded excellent. The other thing we were just exploring right at the end was the need for better communication, and we talked about reversing communication. It's usually been top down, but in a bottom up way, identifying some neighborhood residents to be block representatives and disseminate information to neighbors and be aware of who might need help.
That's great. Yeah, in our group, we were talking about community-based organizations as well as online and SMC alert communications. Does anybody else want to jump in?
Well, I guess I could jump in. I mean, one of the things that came out was the importance of paying attention to our agricultural community, which I think is really, you know, poignant point. I mean, these are essential workers. And, you know, they're out there working in the fields in the heat. And then, you know, when you have the fire and the smoke, some of them probably have had issues, you know, losing a few days on the farm makes a huge difference in terms of what you can get from the farm, or even their farms are partially or all destroyed. So, you know, relief and attention to that is very important.
Thank you. Anybody else like to jump in? I'll call on Zoe if there isn't an immediate jumper.
Zoe actually just lost Wi-Fi connection, but
oh, no.
I'm happy to share some highlights from our breakout room, if that's okay.
Great, thank you, please do.
Yeah, I think we had a very interesting discussion on how cooling centers were used this season compared to seasons in the past. We brought up that cooling centers that have not been marketed as cooling centers, but usually used as a resource are the mall, movie theaters, and libraries. And because those weren't accessible, it seems like there was a more serious need for those things to be, for a cooling center to be developed. And then once the cooling center was developed, there was a lot of apprehension from users, from staff to make that happen this year, just because of the unusual scenario we are in. So there's a lot of opportunity for education and community outreach going forward to make sure if we are in a situation similar to this year, that people feel like they have the tools accessible to them in their own control if we can.
Great, thank you so much, Camille. We're going to share Susan's screen again and wrap things up, but please continue putting in comments and questions, and we'll look forward to following up with an email to answer those and share more resources. Kim, go ahead.
Kim, I think you're on mute.
I hate it when that happens. So there's actually a slide right before this last one that I'm gonna follow on to here. So I want to thank everybody for taking part. I mean, this is really important, and all this input will definitely be used and carefully recorded and sort of typed up and put into the full picture of what we're doing. A special thank you to Hannah and Isabel and Jen and all the facilitators, of course, and of course, thank you very much to the speakers today as well. This was enlightening. We learned a little bit more. There may be more places where we want to dig in a little bit more and learn more about how, for instance, the cities and Office of Emergency Services interact with each other. Of course, as I said, we'll be compiling all of this. The idea is to go for a work plan, sort of short-term, long-term, what can we do before the next heat and probably potentially fire season, of course. We'll share out, some of what it is that we've put together. There will also be a follow-up survey that we'll be sending out, and we hope that if you come up with other thoughts or other ideas, I think that it's really, be helpful to gather as much information as we can out of our effort today. If you'd like to, join the task force, we have information. The email there is for Hannah, and you're welcome to send an email, and we'll add you to the group.